Thomas Aquinas is widely regarded as one of the greatest figures in medieval philosophy and Christian theology. His profound impact on the development of Western thought stretches across the fields of philosophy, theology, ethics, and metaphysics. Born in the 13th century, his works continue to influence modern religious and philosophical discourse, particularly within the Catholic tradition, but also in the broader scope of Western intellectual history. To understand the magnitude of Aquinas' contributions, it is necessary to first explore the context of his life, the intellectual environment of the time, and the lasting importance of his thought. Aquinas was born in 1225 in the Kingdom of Sicily, into an aristocratic family in the town of Roccasecca, located in present-day Italy. The young Thomas was a member of the noble Aquino family, which had significant influence in the region. From an early age, Thomas displayed intellectual promise, but his choice of a religious vocation, particularly joining the newly established Dominican order, was a source of contention for his family. At the time, the Dominican order, with its commitment to preaching and scholarship, was gaining prominence as a center for intellectual and theological innovation. Thomas's decision to enter the order would shape the rest of his life and intellectual career. Aquinas' life can be understood in part through the intellectual currents of the 13th century. This was a period of great religious and philosophical ferment in Europe, where the rediscovery of ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle, began to reshape Christian thought. Aquinas was not merely an inheritor of these traditions, but also a synthesizer who sought to reconcile faith and reason. His work, often referred to as scholasticism, aimed to demonstrate that faith and reason were not in conflict but complementary. The scholarly atmosphere of medieval Europe was dominated by the growing importance of the universities, particularly those in Paris and Bologna. Aquinas studied in these institutions, where his exposure to the intellectual works of Aristotle and the newly translated Greek philosophers deeply influenced his thinking. His teacher, Albert the Great, was instrumental in guiding Aquinas' early intellectual development, particularly in integrating Aristotle's philosophy with Christian doctrine. This intellectual milieu fostered the development of Aquinas' most important ideas, which he would go on to articulate in his monumental works, the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles. Central to Aquinas' philosophy was his synthesis of faith and reason. Unlike many of his contemporaries who may have seen these two realms as contradictory, Aquinas argued that both were necessary for understanding the truth. Reason, when properly applied, could lead to knowledge of the natural world and certain truths about God. Faith, on the other hand, could lead to a deeper understanding of God's will as revealed through Scripture and the teachings of the Church. This harmonious view of faith and reason became a cornerstone of his theological system and was a major reason for his lasting influence. Aquinas' greatest legacy is perhaps his Summa Theologica, a comprehensive work that systematically explores the entire corpus of Christian theology. In this text, Aquinas addresses the nature of God, the human soul, morality, the sacraments, and more. His method was rigorous and analytical, presenting theological questions in a dialectical format, where opposing views were examined and then reconciled. This method of inquiry was based on the Aristotelian logic of syllogism, which Aquinas used to explore complex theological issues in a structured manner. The Summa became the standard reference for Catholic doctrine and was integral to the development of scholastic theology. In addition to the Summa Theologica, Aquinas wrote the Summa Contra Gentiles, a text designed to defend the Christian faith against the arguments of non-believers, particularly those influenced by Islam and Judaism. The Summa Contra Gentiles focuses on the rational proofs of the existence of God and the nature of divine providence. In this work, Aquinas develops arguments for the existence of God that would later be famous as the Five Ways, which remain foundational in the philosophy of religion. While Aquinas' intellectual prowess was undeniable, his personal qualities were also remarkable. He was known for his humility and his deep spirituality. His decision to join the Dominicans was not simply an intellectual one. It was rooted in a genuine desire to live a life of prayer and devotion. Despite his towering intellect, Aquinas remained deeply committed to his religious vocation, living a life of asceticism, prayer, and scholarship. This combination of intellectual brilliance and humility made him a model of the ideal scholar-priest. The influence of Aquinas' thought did not end with his death in 1274. Shortly after his passing, his works became the foundation of Catholic theology. In 1323, Aquinas was canonized as a saint by Pope John XXI, affirming his importance within the Church. In 1568, he was named a Doctor of the Church, a title reserved for theologians whose writings are considered particularly authoritative. His thought became the official philosophical system of the Catholic Church, and his work continues to shape Catholic theology today. Despite the initial resistance he faced from some quarters of his own religious order and from the broader intellectual community, Aquinas' work gradually gained widespread acceptance. His ability to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Christian doctrine provided a robust intellectual foundation that could support both reason and faith. Over the centuries, thinkers in both the Catholic tradition and the broader Western philosophical tradition have drawn on Aquinas' insights, leading to his status as one of the most influential philosophers and theologians in history. The lasting importance of Thomas Aquinas lies in the intellectual framework he established for understanding the relationship between faith and reason, the nature of divine providence, and the ethical foundations of human action. In an era marked by intellectual and theological division, Aquinas sought unity. Unity between philosophy and theology, between reason and revelation, between the human and the divine. His work remains a touchstone for anyone seeking to engage with the profound questions of existence, ethics, and the divine, and his legacy as a philosopher, theologian, and saint remains unparalleled in the history of Western thought. As we embark on this exploration of Thomas Aquinas' life and work, we are reminded not only of his intellectual achievements, but of his enduring relevance in the world today. His ability to synthesize the intellectual traditions of the ancient world with Christian doctrine paved the way for centuries of scholarship, and his approach to philosophy and theology continues to inform contemporary debates. Understanding Aquinas is not simply an exercise in historical scholarship. It is an opportunity to engage with the timeless questions that define the human experience. Thomas Aquinas' early life, though not as well documented as his later achievements, provides crucial context for understanding the intellectual and spiritual development of one of history's most influential philosophers and theologians. Born in 1225 in the town of Roccasecca, located in present-day Italy, Thomas was the son of Landulf of Aquino and Theodora, both of noble birth. His family had deep ties to the feudal aristocracy, and as the youngest son, Thomas was expected to pursue a career that would maintain or enhance the family status. However, Thomas's journey would diverge dramatically from the conventional path his family had envisioned for him, and his intellectual and spiritual pursuits would become central to his legacy. At the age of 5, Thomas was sent to study at the Abbey of Monte Cassino, a Benedictine monastery that was both a center of learning and a place of religious devotion. Here, he was exposed to a monastic way of life that emphasized discipline, education, and prayer. The influence of the Benedictine monks, particularly their commitment to intellectual inquiry and their rigorous approach to study, would play a formative role in Thomas's later academic and theological development. Although this early experience at Monte Cassino was pivotal, it would not be the only stage of his education. By the age of 13, Thomas had moved to the University of Naples to continue his formal education. The University of Naples was a vibrant intellectual center at the time, with a curriculum that emphasized both classical learning and contemporary religious studies. It was here that Thomas was introduced to the works of Aristotle and other ancient Greek philosophers, whose ideas would have a profound influence on his intellectual development. This exposure to Aristotelian philosophy was critical, as it set the stage for his later attempts to reconcile the teachings of Aristotle with Christian theology. The works of Aristotle, long neglected in the West after the fall of the Roman Empire, were being reintroduced through Arabic translations, and scholars at the University of Naples including Thomas, began to study these texts intensively. At Naples, Thomas also began his studies in theology under the guidance of the Dominican order, which had recently established a presence at the university. The Dominicans were a new religious order dedicated to preaching and teaching, with an emphasis on intellectual rigor and scholarly engagement with both Christian doctrine and secular philosophy. It was during his time at Naples that Thomas's life took a decisive turn. In 1244, at the age of 19, Thomas made the controversial decision to join the Dominican order, despite his family's strong objections. His decision to enter the Dominican order, which was in its early stages and had a reputation for intellectual rigor, was not an easy one. Thomas's family, particularly his father, were staunchly opposed to his choice. His family had hoped that Thomas would pursue a career in law or in some other secular profession that would advance the family's social standing. As a result, Thomas was effectively kidnapped by his family and imprisoned in the family castle of Roccasecca for over a year. During this time, Thomas's resolve only strengthened, and his commitment to the religious life and the intellectual path he had chosen remained unwavering. His eventual escape from the family castle, with the help of his Dominican brothers, marked the beginning of his full commitment to the order. Upon his release, Thomas moved to the Dominican convent in Naples, where his formal education continued. His intellectual trajectory was shaped by the guidance of Albert the Great, one of the most renowned scholars of the time and a leading member of the Dominican order. Albert became Thomas's mentor and played a crucial role in shaping his intellectual and philosophical views. Under Albert's tutelage, Thomas was introduced to the philosophy of Aristotle, which would later become the foundation for much of his own philosophical system. Albert's influence on Thomas was profound. It was Albert who helped him to appreciate the potential for synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christian teachings. In addition to studying under Albert the Great, Thomas also began his theological education in earnest. The medieval universities, including those in Paris and Naples, were centers of theological study where scholars rigorously debated the core issues of Christian belief. During this period, Thomas encountered the works of Augustine, Boethius, and other church fathers, whose writings were integral to the intellectual formation of medieval theology. In particular, the Augustinian tradition of Christian thought, with its emphasis on grace and divine illumination, would influence Thomas's understanding of God's relationship with humanity. The intellectual climate of 13th century Europe was one of intense theological and philosophical inquiry. The rediscovery of Aristotle, along with the increasing influence of Islamic and Jewish philosophers, such as Avicenna and Averroes, led to a dynamic exchange of ideas. Scholars were grappling with the integration of reason and faith, and Aquinas, in particular, was drawn to the task of reconciling the philosophical works of Aristotle with the teachings of the Christian faith. The tension between the rational philosophy of Aristotle and the supernatural truths of Christian theology would be a central concern for Thomas throughout his life. Aquinas' time in Naples was crucial not only for his formal education, but also for the formation of his intellectual identity. It was here that he began to develop the theological and philosophical system that would later define his work. He also began to engage with the works of his contemporaries, particularly in the field of scholastic theology. The development of the Summa Theologica, his most famous work, would not occur in a vacuum. Rather, it was the product of years of intellectual growth and reflection that began during his time in Naples and continued throughout his life. By the time Thomas left Naples for Paris in 1248, he had already begun to earn a reputation as a scholar. His decision to move to Paris, which was then the intellectual capital of medieval Europe, marked a new phase in his education and intellectual development. Paris, home to the University of Paris, was a city where some of the brightest minds of the Middle Ages came together to debate matters of faith, reason, and philosophy. The university's reputation for rigorous intellectual inquiry made it an ideal place for Aquinas to further his studies and to contribute to the growing body of scholastic theology. Thomas Aquinas' early life and education were critical in shaping his intellectual trajectory. From his childhood in Roccasecca to his time at the University of Naples, Aquinas was exposed to a range of philosophical and theological ideas that would shape his later works. His decision to join the Dominican order, despite his family's opposition, marked a crucial turning point in his life, setting him on the path to becoming one of the most influential theologians and philosophers in history. His education under Albert the Great, his exposure to Aristotle, and his time at the University of Paris all contributed to the development of his distinctive theological system, which would go on to define scholasticism and influence Western thought for centuries to come. Thomas Aquinas' decision to join the Dominican order was a pivotal moment in his life, one that would profoundly influence his intellectual and spiritual journey. The Dominican order, formerly known as the Order of Preachers, was founded in 1216 by Saint Dominic Delaware Guzman with the primary mission of combating heresy through preaching and teaching. Unlike many monastic orders of the time, the Dominicans embraced an active lifestyle that combined scholarly pursuits with the work of evangelism. This focus on intellectual engagement with the world, alongside a commitment to poverty, chastity, and obedience, attracted many bright minds, including Thomas Aquinas. The Dominican order's approach to education and scholarship was distinctly different from the traditional monastic orders of the time, which were often more focused on prayer and manual labor. The Dominicans emphasized the importance of rigorous academic study, especially in theology and philosophy, and they encouraged their members to engage with contemporary intellectual trends. It was this emphasis on intellectual inquiry, particularly through the study of philosophy, that drew Thomas to the Dominicans. His decision to enter the order was not simply a spiritual one, but also an intellectual commitment to pursue a deeper understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. However, Thomas's decision to join the Dominicans was met with significant resistance, especially from his family. Coming from a noble family, his parents had expected him to pursue a career that would further enhance their social standing. His family's disapproval was so strong that, at the age of 19, his relatives imprisoned him in the family castle at Roccasecca, hoping to persuade him to abandon his decision. Despite this confinement, Thomas's resolve remained unshaken. The story of his escape from the castle, aided by his Dominican brothers, has become part of his legend and symbolizes his unwavering commitment to his religious vocation. Once Thomas was freed, he quickly moved to the Dominican convent in Naples, where he could continue his theological and philosophical education. This period marked the beginning of his formal training within the Dominican order. The order's intellectual rigor would play a central role in shaping his thought. The Dominicans were known for their commitment to the study of both sacred and secular philosophy, and it was in this environment that Thomas first encountered the works of Aristotle, which would later become a cornerstone of his philosophical system. Thomas's intellectual development was guided by figures such as Albert the Great, one of the leading scholars of the time and a prominent member of the Dominican order. In addition to his intellectual formation, Thomas's life within the Dominican order provided him with the opportunity to deepen his spiritual life. The order's emphasis on prayer, contemplation, and devotion was integral to the Dominican way of life. Thomas's commitment to prayer and religious discipline was evident in his personal habits. Despite his intellectual brilliance, he maintained a humble, ascetic lifestyle, often rising early for prayer and spending long hours in study. His deep spirituality was not separate from his intellectual pursuits, but was intertwined with them, as he believed that true knowledge of God could only be attained through both reason and devotion. During his time in Naples, Thomas's role within the Dominican order expanded. He was not only a student, but also began to take on teaching responsibilities. His duties as a teacher allowed him to refine his understanding of theology and philosophy, and he began to develop the ideas that would later form the foundation of his most famous works. The Dominican emphasis on teaching and preaching meant that Thomas was encouraged to articulate his ideas clearly and systematically, a practice that would be reflected in the methodical structure of his later works, particularly in the Summa Theologica. This formative period in Naples helped Thomas to establish a reputation as a scholar and theologian, setting the stage for his future contributions to the intellectual and theological traditions of the Church. After his studies in Naples, Thomas moved to Paris in 1248 to continue his education at the University of Paris, which was one of the most prestigious academic centers in Europe at the time. Paris was the heart of scholasticism, a method of intellectual inquiry that sought to reconcile faith and reason through rigorous dialectical reasoning. At the University of Paris, Thomas encountered a vibrant intellectual community that included scholars from across Europe. It was in Paris that Thomas began to work more closely with the Aristotelian philosophy that would become central to his theological system. The teachings of Aristotle had been reintroduced to the West through translations from Arabic, and these works were having a profound impact on European scholarship. In Paris, Thomas studied under the guidance of the great scholar Albert the Great, who was also a member of the Dominican order. Albert played a crucial role in Thomas's intellectual development, guiding him in the integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. Albert was one of the first thinkers to attempt a systematic reconciliation of Aristotle's philosophy with the doctrines of the Church, and his influence on Thomas was profound. Under Albert's mentorship, Thomas began to develop the framework for his own approach to theology and philosophy, one that would combine the rationalism of Aristotle with the spiritual and theological insights of Christianity. The Dominican order's role in fostering intellectual development was crucial to the formation of Aquinas' thought. While many monks in other orders focused primarily on prayer and contemplation, the Dominicans emphasized education and engagement with the world. This approach allowed Thomas to engage deeply with contemporary philosophical trends while remaining grounded in the theological traditions of the Church. The order's focus on preaching and teaching also meant that Thomas's intellectual pursuits were always linked to practical applications. He was not merely an academic, but also a teacher and preacher, committed to making his theological insights accessible to others. Aquinas' time within the Dominican order also involved his growing commitment to the priesthood. While his intellectual pursuits were a central part of his life, his religious vocation was equally significant. The Dominican order's commitment to poverty, chastity, and obedience was not just a matter of personal piety, but also a way of life that was meant to reflect the teachings of Christ. For Thomas, the priesthood was not an ancillary aspect of his life, but the very foundation of his intellectual work. His theological reflections on the nature of God, grace, and salvation were always informed by his deep sense of devotion to God and his commitment to the priestly vocation. Thomas was ordained a priest in 1250, and this event marked the beginning of a new phase in his life. His ordination to the priesthood was not merely a ceremonial rite, but a commitment to a life of service, both intellectual and spiritual. As a priest, Thomas continued to teach, write, and preach, using his theological insights to guide others in their faith. His work as a preacher and teacher in the Dominican order helped to shape the intellectual climate of the time, as he sought to integrate the new philosophical ideas of Aristotle with the ancient Christian tradition. Thomas Aquinas' path to the priesthood and his time within the Dominican order were critical in shaping his intellectual and spiritual life. The order provided him with the intellectual tools and support necessary to engage with the great philosophical and theological questions of his time. His decision to join the Dominicans, despite his family's objections, was a decisive moment that set him on a path of intellectual and religious engagement that would profoundly impact the future of Western thought. His education under figures like Albert the Great, his commitment to both reason and faith, and his priestly vocation all contributed to the development of the theological system that would come to define scholasticism. Through the Dominican order, Thomas Aquinas not only found a place to hone his intellectual skills, but also a community in which he could live out his devotion to God through both prayer and teaching. One of the most defining aspects of Thomas Aquinas' intellectual journey was his engagement with the philosophy of Aristotle. The 13th century saw a revival of Aristotle's works, largely due to translations from Arabic texts, which had preserved and transmitted much of the ancient Greek philosophers' thought. Aquinas, deeply immersed in the scholastic tradition that sought to reconcile faith and reason, saw in Aristotle a rich source of insights that could be integrated with Christian doctrine. His engagement with Aristotle's philosophy was not simply an academic pursuit, but a transformative process that shaped the core of his theological and philosophical system. Aquinas' relationship with Aristotle was grounded in a deep appreciation for the philosopher's systematic approach to logic, ethics, metaphysics, and natural philosophy. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, for example, offered a robust framework for understanding human happiness and virtue, which Aquinas later integrated with Christian teachings on grace and salvation. His study of Aristotle's metaphysics allowed him to develop a sophisticated understanding of being, causality, and the nature of God. For Aquinas, Aristotle's thought provided a foundational structure that could support a Christian worldview, but he also recognized the limits of Aristotle's philosophy, particularly in matters of divine revelation and grace. This tension between Aristotle's naturalism and Christian supernaturalism would be a recurring theme in Aquinas' work. One of Aquinas' greatest intellectual achievements was his ability to synthesize Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology. In his early writings, Thomas explored how Aristotelian ideas could be reconciled with the biblical teachings of the Church. He saw Aristotle's emphasis on reason and empirical observation as complementary to the Christian faith, which was rooted in divine revelation. The Summa Theologica, Aquinas' magnum opus, illustrates this synthesis in its methodical exploration of theological and philosophical questions. Throughout the Summa, Aquinas employed Aristotelian logic and concepts, such as substance, form, and causality, to articulate Christian doctrines like the existence of God, the nature of the soul, and the problem of evil. At the heart of Aquinas' engagement with Aristotle was his understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. In the medieval scholastic tradition, there was often tension between these two domains of knowledge. Some thinkers, especially from the Augustinian tradition, held that reason was subordinated to faith, while others, like the Averroists, believed that reason could stand independently of faith. Aquinas, however, sought to reconcile these two realms. He argued that reason, when properly used, could lead to truths that were consistent with and complementary to divine revelation. He saw faith as dealing with truths that were beyond the reach of reason, such as the mysteries of the Trinity and the Incarnation, but he also believed that natural reason could lead to knowledge of God's existence and the moral order of the universe. Aquinas' use of Aristotle's concept of causality was instrumental in shaping his arguments for the existence of God. In his famous 5 Ways, found in the Summa Theologica, Aquinas employed Aristotelian logic to demonstrate that the existence of a first cause or unmoved mover was a necessary condition for explaining the universe's existence and order. Drawing upon Aristotle's idea of motion and causality, Aquinas argued that the chain of causes in the world must ultimately lead to an uncaused cause, which he identified as God. This argument for the existence of God, based on Aristotelian principles, became one of the most famous aspects of Aquinas' philosophical legacy and remains a cornerstone of the philosophy of religion. In addition to the 5 Ways, Aquinas' work on ethics was heavily influenced by Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle's conception of virtue as a mean between extremes, his emphasis on human flourishing, eudaimonia, and his focus on the role of reason in guiding human action were all central to Aquinas' ethical thought. However, Aquinas expanded on Aristotle's framework by integrating the concept of divine grace. For Aquinas, human beings could not achieve true moral perfection through reason alone. While natural reason could lead to an understanding of the moral law, it was through God's grace, made manifest in the teachings of Christ, that humans could achieve salvation and eternal life. Aquinas' ethical system, therefore, was a hybrid of Aristotelian virtue ethics and Christian theological principles, which emphasized the transformative role of grace in moral action. Aquinas' engagement with Aristotle also extended to natural philosophy, or what we would now call science. Aristotle's empirical approach to studying the natural world, though based on the limited scientific knowledge of his time, laid the groundwork for later developments in the philosophy of science. Aquinas adopted many of Aristotle's ideas about the nature of the physical world, including the four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final, and applied them to theological questions. For example, Aquinas used Aristotelian concepts of motion and change to explain the creation of the universe and the ongoing processes of divine providence. While Aquinas did not have access to the modern scientific tools and methods we have today, his natural philosophy was grounded in an empirical understanding of the world, and his method of inquiry emphasized observation and rational explanation. Despite his deep admiration for Aristotle, Aquinas was also keenly aware of the limitations of Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle's naturalistic worldview did not account for the supernatural truths of Christianity, such as the incarnation and the resurrection. Aquinas believed that while reason could lead to certain knowledge of God and the natural order, there were aspects of divine revelation that could only be known through faith. For example, Aristotle's philosophy was silent on the question of divine grace, which was central to Aquinas' Christian theology. Aquinas, therefore, made a distinction between natural theology, which could be known through reason, and revealed theology, which could only be known through faith in Scripture. This distinction allowed Aquinas to maintain the integrity of both faith and reason, arguing that the two could never contradict, but rather worked in harmony. One of the most significant aspects of Aquinas' intellectual development was his commitment to the unity of truth. In his view, all truth ultimately comes from God, and therefore, any apparent conflict between reason and revelation must be the result of misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Aquinas was deeply committed to the idea that philosophy and theology should work together to uncover the truth, and that reason and faith could be mutually supportive. This holistic view of truth was integral to his intellectual project and helped to shape his broader understanding of the relationship between God, the world, and human beings. It also laid the foundation for the later development of the philosophy of science, which would come to dominate European intellectual life in the centuries following Aquinas. Aquinas' engagement with Aristotle also had a lasting impact on the scholastic tradition, which would dominate European universities for centuries. The synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology that Aquinas achieved was groundbreaking and set the stage for future theological and philosophical developments. His method of inquiry, which combined rigorous dialectical reasoning with a deep commitment to faith, became the model for later thinkers, both in the Catholic tradition and beyond. Even in the face of challenges from later philosophers like William of Ockham and the rise of humanism during the Renaissance, Aquinas' integration of faith and reason remained a cornerstone of Christian thought. Thomas Aquinas' intellectual development was profoundly shaped by his engagement with Aristotle's philosophy. While Aquinas did not accept Aristotle's teachings uncritically, he saw in the philosopher's works a powerful framework for understanding both the natural world and divine truths. Aquinas' ability to synthesize Aristotle's ideas with Christian doctrine was one of his greatest achievements, and it laid the foundation for much of his later theological and philosophical work. Through his careful integration of faith and reason, natural philosophy and theology, Aquinas established a framework for understanding the world that would influence Western thought for centuries to come. His legacy, particularly in the areas of metaphysics, ethics, and the philosophy of religion, remains a central part of the intellectual tradition of both the Catholic Church and Western philosophy. Thomas Aquinas' intellectual framework was not only shaped by Aristotle's philosophy, but also by the rich theological tradition of the Church Fathers, particularly St. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, whose writings profoundly influenced Western Christianity, played a pivotal role in shaping Aquinas' theological thought, especially in relation to topics such as divine grace, the nature of the soul, and the problem of evil. Aquinas' engagement with Augustine was not simply one of reverence for a theological giant, but also of intellectual dialogue, as Aquinas sought to reconcile Augustine's teachings with the philosophical tools he had inherited from Aristotle. Augustine's influence on Aquinas is perhaps most evident in the realm of grace and salvation. Augustine's view of grace emphasized the necessity of God's intervention in human affairs for salvation. For Augustine, The human will, tainted by original sin, was incapable of turning toward God without the aid of divine grace. This Augustinian conception of grace, which emphasized God's sovereignty and the necessity of divine assistance, became a cornerstone of Aquinas' theological system. Aquinas accepted Augustine's view that grace was essential for salvation, but developed it further, integrating it into his broader theological and philosophical framework. Unlike Augustine, who tended to emphasize the utter dependence of humanity on grace, Aquinas sought to reconcile this with a more robust view of human nature, which he saw as capable of cooperating with divine grace through the use of reason. Aquinas' understanding of the nature of grace was heavily influenced by Augustine's conception of human freedom and divine predestination. Augustine famously argued that human beings, in their fallen state, could not choose to follow God without God's grace. In Aquinas' system, however, grace was not an overriding force that eliminated human freedom. Instead, he argued that God's grace works with human nature to elevate and perfect it. Aquinas believed that grace did not destroy human free will, but rather perfected it, enabling individuals to make choices in accordance with God's will. This distinction between grace as a cooperative force rather than a coercive one was one of the key elements of Aquinas' theological thought and became a central theme in his writings on salvation. Aquinas also drew upon Augustine's views on the nature of the soul. For Augustine, the soul was understood as a rational and immortal substance, capable of knowing and loving God. This concept of the soul as a rational and immaterial substance was foundational for Aquinas' own understanding of human nature. In his Summa Theologica, Aquinas elaborated on Augustine's teachings about the soul, affirming its immortality and its capacity for reason. For Aquinas, the soul was the principle of life and the seat of human cognition, and its faculties, intellect and will, were essential to understanding how human beings relate to God and to one another. Aquinas' elaboration of the soul, while indebted to Augustine, also incorporated Aristotelian ideas about form and matter, resulting in a more integrated understanding of human nature that included both spiritual and physical aspects. The influence of Augustine was also crucial for Aquinas' theology of the will and the problem of evil. Augustine's writings on the will, particularly in his works such as Confessions and The City of God, provided a framework for understanding how human beings are capable of choosing evil. Augustine argued that evil was not a substance in itself, but a privation of good, a corruption of the will that leads human beings away from God. Aquinas followed this Augustinian line of thought, arguing that evil is not a created thing, but a lack or deficiency in being. For Aquinas, sin and evil were the result of human free will's misalignment with God's ultimate good. The question of how free will could coexist with the existence of an all-powerful, benevolent God was a central concern for both Augustine and Aquinas, and Aquinas adopted Augustine's view that free will was a necessary component of moral responsibility, even in a world where evil exists. Augustine's influence extended to Aquinas' understanding of divine providence and the nature of God's action in the world. Augustine's conception of providence was deeply rooted in the idea that God's ultimate plan for the universe was good and that human suffering, while real, could ultimately be understood within the context of God's greater purpose. Aquinas adopted this view in his own theology, affirming that God's providence guides all things toward their proper end, even when human beings do not fully understand or perceive it. For Aquinas, divine providence was not a deterministic force that eliminated human freedom, but rather a guiding presence that worked through the natural order and human decisions to bring about the ultimate good. In addition to these theological ideas, Augustine's writings also helped to shape Aquinas' views on Scripture and the relationship between faith and reason. Augustine famously wrote in Confessions that he would not have believed in the Scriptures if he had not already had a personal relationship with God. For Augustine, the Scriptures were the authoritative source of divine truth, but their interpretation required the guidance of the Holy Spirit and a personal encounter with God. Aquinas, while deeply committed to the authority of Scripture, also believed that reason played an essential role in interpreting the Bible. For Aquinas, faith and reason were complementary, with faith providing the revealed truths of God and reason offering the intellectual tools to understand and defend those truths. This integration of faith and reason was not only a hallmark of Aquinas' thought, but also a continuation of Augustine's own approach to the relationship between the two. Aquinas' intellectual engagement with Augustine was not one of mere repetition of Augustine's ideas, but rather a process of dialogue and development. While Aquinas accepted many of Augustine's core teachings, he also sought to clarify, refine, and systematize them within the context of the intellectual culture of his time. For example, while Augustine emphasized the predestination of souls to salvation or damnation, Aquinas took a more moderate approach, emphasizing the role of human free will in responding to God's grace. Similarly, Augustine's more mystical theology, which emphasized the interior experience of God, was balanced by Aquinas' more philosophical approach, which sought to articulate the nature of God and the divine attributes in systematic terms. One of the critical areas in which Aquinas advanced Augustine's thought was in his understanding of the nature of the Church and the sacraments. Augustine had written extensively on the role of the Church as the visible body of Christ and the means through which salvation is communicated. Aquinas built on Augustine's theology of the Church, emphasizing the Church's role as the dispenser of divine grace, particularly through the sacraments. For Aquinas, the sacraments were not merely symbolic acts, but real channels of grace that brought believers into closer communion with God. This sacramental theology was rooted in the Augustinian view of grace, but developed further in Aquinas' understanding of the ontological effects of the sacraments. Another significant area where Augustine's influence was evident was in Aquinas' development of a Christian philosophy of history. Augustine's City of God provided a theological framework for understanding the course of human history, particularly in relation to the fall of the Roman Empire and the establishment of the Church. Aquinas, building on Augustine's insights, developed a more systematic theology of history, which saw human history as a gradual unfolding of divine providence, culminating in the ultimate restoration of the world through the second coming of Christ. For Aquinas, history was not a random series of events, but a divinely orchestrated process that moved toward a specific eschatological goal. The influence of St. Augustine on Thomas Aquinas was profound and far-reaching. Augustine's writings provided the foundational theological concepts that Aquinas would build upon, particularly in the areas of grace, the soul, free will, evil, and divine providence. Aquinas' ability to engage with Augustine's thought critically and systematically allowed him to develop a robust theological system that integrated Augustine's insights with Aristotelian philosophy and the intellectual currents of his own time. In this sense, Aquinas' thought represents not a rejection of Augustine, but rather a synthesis of Augustinian theology with the intellectual tools provided by Aristotle and other philosophers. The result was a theology that was both deeply rooted in the Christian tradition and intellectually sophisticated, one that would shape the course of Western Christian thought for centuries to come. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica stands as one of the most influential works in Christian theology and Western philosophy. Its completion marked the culmination of Aquinas' intellectual journey and his ambition to synthesize faith and reason into a coherent system. The Summa is not merely a theological treatise. It is a systematic exploration of the entire Christian faith, from the nature of God to the moral duties of human beings, the role of Christ in salvation, and the ultimate end of humanity in the beatific vision. It is a text that seeks to provide answers to the most profound questions of existence, offering a comprehensive and structured account of Christian doctrine. This work, often regarded as his magnum opus, was crafted with an academic precision that drew on Aquinas' vast knowledge of Aristotle, Augustine, and many other theological and philosophical traditions. The structure of the Summa Theologica is one of its most distinctive features. It is divided into three main parts. The first part, Part 1, deals with God and His creation, including arguments for the existence of God, the nature of the divine attributes, and the creation of the world. The second part, Part 2, is subdivided into two sections. The first section discusses human beings, their happiness, and the moral life, while the second section addresses Christ, the sacraments, and the role of grace in salvation. And the third part, Part 3, focuses on the life of Christ, the sacraments, and the end of human beings. Within each of these sections, Aquinas presents a series of questions, typically around 300 in total, each followed by objections, a resolution to the objections, and a detailed explanation of the correct answer. The organization of the Summa reflects Aquinas' methodological approach to theology. It is both philosophical and doctrinal, with Aquinas employing logical reasoning to elucidate and defend the truths of the Christian faith. This approach was grounded in a commitment to the Aristotelian tradition of dialectical reasoning, in which propositions are carefully examined and scrutinized through reasoned argumentation. The Summa engages with the great theological questions of its time, such as the existence of God, the problem of evil, the nature of the soul, the efficacy of the sacraments, and the nature of salvation, all while integrating insights from both classical philosophy and Christian revelation. One of the key features of the Summa is its use of the question method, in which Aquinas presents a theological issue and considers opposing views before offering his own response. This method reflects Aquinas' belief in the importance of reason and rational debate, and it allows for a thorough exploration of complex topics. Each question is posed in a clear and concise manner, followed by objections that represent different positions on the matter, often drawn from Scripture, church fathers, or philosophers. Aquinas then provides his own answer, along with a detailed explanation of why he believes his position is the most logical and consistent with Christian doctrine. This method serves not only to clarify theological concepts, but also to demonstrate the harmony between faith and reason, a theme that runs throughout the Summa. One of the central themes in the Summa is Aquinas' doctrine of God. In the first part, Aquinas systematically explores the nature of God, drawing on Aristotelian and Augustinian principles to argue for the existence of a first cause, a necessary being that explains the order of the universe. His famous 5 ways are found here, offering rational arguments for the existence of God based on motion, causality, contingency, degrees of perfection, and design. These arguments have been highly influential in the history of philosophy and continue to be discussed in debates on theism and the philosophy of religion. For Aquinas, the existence of God is not only a matter of faith, but also a rational conclusion drawn from the observation of the natural world. Through these arguments, he sought to demonstrate that belief in God is not irrational, but rather an affirmation of a truth that can be discovered through reason. In the second part of the Summa, Aquinas turns to the human being and the moral life. He explores the nature of human happiness, which he argues is found in the beatific vision of God. For Aquinas, human beings are capable of knowing and loving God through reason and will, but because of original sin, they require divine grace to achieve true happiness. This understanding of the human condition, which integrates natural law with divine revelation, forms the foundation of Aquinas' ethics. He famously argues that human beings can attain moral perfection by following the natural law, which is inscribed in the human heart by God, and by cooperating with the divine grace that perfects their ability to choose good. Aquinas also develops a nuanced understanding of virtues and vices, drawing on Aristotle's ethics, but incorporating Christian teachings about charity, faith, and hope. The moral life, for Aquinas, is not just about individual virtue, but also about the pursuit of a communal good in accordance with God's plan. The second part also delves into Aquinas' theology of grace, a topic that was central to his system. For Aquinas, grace is a supernatural gift from God that elevates human nature and enables individuals to live according to divine law. He distinguishes between actual grace, which is the divine help given to individuals in particular situations, and sanctifying grace, which is the gift that transforms the soul and makes it capable of union with God. This grace is central to Aquinas' understanding of salvation, as it is only through grace that human beings can overcome the effects of original sin and attain eternal life. The sacraments, for Aquinas, are the primary means by which grace is dispensed to the faithful. He carefully analyzes the efficacy and necessity of each of the 7 sacraments, showing how they function as instruments of divine grace. In the third part of the Summa, Aquinas turns his attention to the life of Christ, the sacraments, and the ultimate end of human beings. His discussion of the person of Christ, the incarnation, and the atonement is both theologically rich and philosophically sophisticated. Aquinas builds on the doctrine of the hypostatic union, the belief that Christ is both fully divine and fully human, to explain how Christ's life and death were necessary for human salvation. For Aquinas, the atonement is not just a matter of satisfying God's justice, but also a means by which humanity is reconciled with God. The sacraments, especially the Eucharist, are the means by which this reconciliation is made present in the life of the Church. Aquinas' treatment of the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist, remains one of the most influential theological accounts of these rites in Christian tradition. The Summa also provides a detailed analysis of the moral life and the pursuit of virtue. Aquinas' ethical theory is grounded in his understanding of human nature, which is both rational and capable of freely choosing to follow God. He draws on Aristotle's concept of virtue as a mean between extremes, but integrates this with a Christian understanding of the theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. Aquinas' moral theology emphasizes the importance of both natural law and divine grace in guiding human action, and it presents a vision of human flourishing that is ultimately directed toward God. In terms of its impact, the Summa Theologica had a profound influence on both Catholic and secular thought. For centuries, it was the definitive text used in Catholic education and theology, shaping the development of church doctrine. It also became a central text in the broader intellectual tradition, influencing philosophers, theologians, and scholars across a wide range of disciplines. Aquinas' ability to reconcile faith and reason, natural philosophy, and Christian theology marked a turning point in the intellectual history of the West, establishing a framework for the continued development of Christian thought and Western philosophy. However, the Summa is not without its challenges. Aquinas himself did not complete the work in his lifetime, and much of it was left unfinished. The vast scope and complexity of the text, combined with the difficulty of some of its arguments, have led to ongoing debates about how to interpret and apply Aquinas' teachings. Nonetheless, the Summa remains an enduring testament to Aquinas' intellectual genius and his commitment to the unity of truth. His systematic approach to theology and philosophy continues to resonate with scholars and thinkers today, offering a comprehensive vision of the relationship between God, humanity, and the world. The Summa Theologica represents the pinnacle of Thomas Aquinas' intellectual achievements. It is a work that synthesizes theology and philosophy, offering a comprehensive account of Christian doctrine, the nature of God, the moral life, and the ultimate end of humanity. Through its systematic structure and rigorous use of reason, Aquinas crafted a work that not only addresses the theological questions of his time, but also provides a framework for understanding the relationship between faith and reason that continues to influence thinkers to this day. The Summa is a monumental achievement that reflects the depth of Aquinas' intellectual vision and his commitment to the unity of truth. The intellectual legacy of Thomas Aquinas is immense, extending far beyond his own time. His contributions to theology, philosophy, and the relationship between faith and reason were foundational for the development of both medieval scholasticism and later intellectual movements. In the centuries following his death, Aquinas' work became central to the development of Catholic theology and played a significant role in the shaping of Western philosophy. His synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine provided a framework that allowed for the continued engagement with ancient philosophical ideas while maintaining fidelity to Christian teachings. This chapter will explore the profound impact of Aquinas' thought tracing its influence through medieval scholasticism, the Renaissance, and into modern philosophy, as well as its continued relevance in contemporary theological and philosophical debates. Aquinas' influence on medieval thought was immediate and profound. In the centuries following his death, his works were studied, commented upon, and integrated into the scholastic curriculum of the universities of Europe. One of the central ways in which Aquinas influenced medieval theology was through his integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. While earlier Christian thinkers, such as Augustine, had incorporated Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas into their theology, Aquinas turned to Aristotle's empirical and systematic approach to philosophy, believing that it could help clarify and defend Christian teachings. This Aristotelian framework provided a foundation for the development of theological and philosophical inquiry in the late medieval period, setting the stage for the intellectual developments of the High Middle Ages. Aquinas' Summa Theologica became a central text in the educational curriculum of medieval universities, particularly in the late 13th and 14th centuries. The scholastics, who followed Aquinas' method of dialectical reasoning, often used his works as the basis for their own theological and philosophical explorations. This led to the development of a distinct scholastic tradition that combined rigorous intellectual inquiry with religious devotion. The primary aim of medieval scholasticism was to harmonize faith and reason, and Aquinas' work was a critical part of that project. His emphasis on the use of reason to understand and articulate Christian doctrine helped to shape the intellectual climate of the time, particularly in relation to the natural world, human nature, and the divine. Aquinas' influence was not limited to his immediate successors. It also had a profound effect on later theological developments. During the Renaissance, which saw a renewed interest in the study of classical antiquity, Aquinas' synthesis of Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy continued to be a vital intellectual resource. Renaissance thinkers, particularly those in the Catholic tradition, found in Aquinas a model for reconciling the ancient wisdom of Aristotle with the teachings of the Church. Aquinas' work offered a way to maintain the integrity of Christian teachings while engaging with the philosophical traditions of antiquity, which were undergoing a revival in the Renaissance. In addition to the Renaissance, Aquinas' influence also extended into the early modern period. During the Reformation, Aquinas' thought was utilized by Catholic scholars in opposition to the ideas of Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. While the Protestant Reformation rejected much of the medieval scholastic tradition, Catholic theologians saw in Aquinas' work a model for defending traditional Catholic doctrines, particularly in relation to the sacraments, the nature of the Church, and the authority of the papacy. Aquinas' defense of the harmony between faith and reason also offered a counterpoint to the radical emphasis on sola scriptura, Scripture alone, advocated by the Reformers. As a result, Aquinas' works were preserved and promoted by the Catholic Church as a way to uphold the authority of Church teachings in the face of Protestant criticism. Aquinas' influence also reached into the world of philosophy, where his synthesis of reason and faith was an important source of inspiration for later thinkers. In the 17th century, as modern philosophy began to take shape, Aquinas' emphasis on the compatibility of reason and revelation remained a central theme in the work of Catholic philosophers. One of the most notable figures in this regard was Francisco Suarez, a Jesuit philosopher and theologian who was influenced by Aquinas' scholastic method and his view of the relationship between reason and faith. Suarez, like Aquinas, saw human reason as capable of understanding the natural world and defending the existence of God, while also recognizing the limits of human understanding when it came to supernatural truths. In Enlightenment, however, Aquinas' thought faced significant challenges. The rise of empiricism, rationalism, and secularism led to a shift away from the medieval synthesis of faith and reason. Philosophers like René Descartes, John Locke, and Immanuel Kant developed new approaches to knowledge and reality that were often in tension with Aquinas' Aristotelian and Thomistic framework. In particular, the Enlightenment emphasis on reason as the primary source of knowledge and the growing skepticism toward religious authority led to a decline in the influence of Aquinas' theological and philosophical system. Nevertheless, Aquinas' work was not entirely abandoned. Rather, it became a point of reference for thinkers who sought to bridge the gap between faith and reason in an increasingly secular world. In the 19th century, the Catholic Church reaffirmed the importance of Aquinas' thought in the wake of Enlightenment and the rise of modern philosophy. Pope Leo XIII, in his 1879 encyclical Aeterni Patris, called for a revival of Thomistic philosophy and theology as a way to combat the secularism and relativism of the time. Leo XII's encyclical led to a resurgence of interest in Aquinas' work, particularly in Catholic educational institutions. The revival of Thomism during this period sought to return to the scholastic tradition and reaffirm the compatibility of faith and reason in an age marked by scientific progress and philosophical skepticism. The 20th century saw a further reinvigoration of Thomism, particularly in the fields of philosophy and theology. Scholars such as Jacques Maritain and Étienne Gilson revived interest in Aquinas' thought, emphasizing its relevance for addressing modern philosophical and theological questions. Maritain, in particular, argued that Thomism offered a way to reconcile modern science with Christian faith, and he sought to demonstrate how Aquinas' philosophy could provide a foundation for a comprehensive Christian worldview in the modern era. Gilson, for his part, focused on the historical and intellectual context of Aquinas' work, emphasizing how his thought represented a synthesis of classical philosophy and Christian doctrine that was still valuable for contemporary thinkers. In contemporary philosophy and theology, Aquinas' legacy continues to be felt. His writings on ethics, metaphysics, and the nature of God remain essential texts in Christian philosophy and continue to inform discussions on topics such as natural law, the nature of the soul, and the existence of God. His work is particularly influential in Catholic theology, where it serves as a foundation for understanding doctrines related to grace, salvation, and the sacraments. In the philosophical arena, Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God and his analysis of the natural world continue to shape debates on the relationship between science and religion, with many contemporary thinkers seeking to find common ground between the two. Moreover, Aquinas' approach to philosophy and theology, which emphasizes the harmony between faith and reason, has found renewed relevance in a world increasingly marked by religious pluralism and secularism. In an era where many view science and religion as mutually exclusive, Aquinas' thought offers a framework for dialogue and understanding. His commitment to the use of reason in understanding divine truths, while recognizing the limits of human knowledge, provides a way for contemporary thinkers to engage with both religious and scientific perspectives in a manner that is respectful of both. Thomas Aquinas' intellectual legacy is one of unparalleled depth and lasting impact. His synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian doctrine laid the foundation for much of Western intellectual thought in the medieval period and beyond. Aquinas' work influenced not only medieval scholasticism, but also the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the development of modern philosophy. His ideas continue to shape contemporary discussions in both philosophy and theology, offering a robust framework for understanding the relationship between faith, reason, and the natural world. As such, Aquinas' thought remains a central pillar of the intellectual tradition, ensuring his place as one of the most significant thinkers in the history of Western philosophy and theology. Thomas Aquinas' intellectual legacy is marked not only by his vast contributions to Christian theology and philosophy, but also by the controversies that surrounded his ideas, both during his lifetime and in the centuries that followed. These controversies were both theological and philosophical. As a synthesis of faith and reason, his Aristotelian-influenced metaphysics and his views on key Christian doctrines were the subject of intense scrutiny, debate, and sometimes even opposition. The key controversies surrounding Aquinas' thought can be grouped into three broad areas: his relationship to earlier Christian thinkers, his integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, and the challenges posed by later philosophical developments. These areas of controversy reveal the complexity of Aquinas' thought and its ability to provoke ongoing intellectual engagement. One of the earliest controversies that arose in response to Aquinas' work was his relationship to earlier Christian thinkers, particularly Augustine. While Aquinas is often regarded as a follower of Augustine's theology, particularly with regard to the doctrines of grace and the nature of the Church, he also sought to synthesize Augustine's thought with the philosophy of Aristotle. This synthesis of Aristotelian and Augustinian ideas was not always well received by Aquinas' contemporaries, many of whom were more closely aligned with Augustinian theology. Some saw Aquinas' use of Aristotle as a threat to the purity of Christian doctrine, fearing that the philosopher's teachings would undermine the Christian emphasis on divine grace and the supernatural. Augustine himself had been critical of certain aspects of Aristotelian philosophy, and so it is not surprising that Aquinas' attempt to incorporate Aristotle's metaphysics into Christian theology would raise concerns. Aquinas' emphasis on human reason as a means of understanding divine truths was also a point of contention. While Augustine had emphasized the need for divine illumination in the act of knowing God, Aquinas took a more optimistic view of human reason's ability to know certain truths about the world and God through natural means. This position was influenced by Aristotle's philosophy, which viewed reason as a powerful tool for understanding the natural order. Aquinas' belief that human beings could reason their way to knowledge of God, the cosmos, and morality was not universally accepted by all theologians, especially those who emphasized the need for divine revelation as the sole source of theological knowledge. This tension between reason and revelation, a central theme in Aquinas' work, led to sharp debates about the role of philosophy in Christian theology and the proper relationship between faith and reason. Another significant area of controversy surrounding Aquinas was his use of Aristotle's metaphysical system, particularly in relation to the nature of God and creation. Aquinas' commitment to Aristotelian categories, such as substance, accident, and causality, was groundbreaking in its attempt to reconcile Christian theology with the intellectual tradition of the ancient Greeks. However, this effort raised questions about the compatibility of Aristotelian thought with Christian doctrine. For example, Aristotle's philosophy was based on a view of the universe as a closed, self-contained system governed by natural laws, whereas Christian theology emphasized the creation of the world by a transcendent God who could intervene in the natural order. Aquinas' attempt to reconcile these two views led to complex discussions about the nature of divine causality, the relationship between God and the created world, and the possibility of miracles. Some critics argued that Aquinas' reliance on Aristotle's metaphysical framework risked reducing the divine to mere natural causality, thus undermining the supernatural aspects of Christian faith. Moreover, Aquinas' understanding of God's relationship to the world and his actions in the world was also a source of controversy. One of Aquinas' most influential arguments was his 5 ways for proving the existence of God, which relied heavily on Aristotelian principles of motion, causality, and contingency. However, some theologians argued that Aquinas' philosophical approach did not fully account for the mystery of divine revelation. For example, while Aquinas attempted to show that reason could lead to the knowledge of God's existence, others maintained that God's nature and actions were ultimately beyond the reach of human reason and could only be known through faith. Aquinas' reliance on philosophical arguments to establish the existence and nature of God, though a major contribution to natural theology, thus faced criticism from those who believed that the divine was wholly transcendent and unknowable by human reason alone. Aquinas also faced opposition on the matter of divine grace and the nature of salvation. His teachings on grace were controversial, especially in relation to the doctrines of Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism, which had been condemned by the Church. Aquinas emphasized that grace was necessary for human beings to achieve salvation, and he carefully articulated the relationship between human free will and divine grace. His view of grace as an elevating force that cooperates with human nature, rather than overriding or replacing it, was in contrast to some more Augustinian or predestinarian views of grace, which were seen as operating in a more determinative and unilateral way. This theological debate over the nature of grace, particularly in the context of salvation, continued to spark controversies in the centuries following Aquinas' death, especially during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation periods. The role of the sacraments in Aquinas' theology also led to controversy, particularly his views on the Eucharist. Aquinas' articulation of the doctrine of transubstantiation, in which the substance of the bread and wine is transformed into the body and blood of Christ while retaining their accidents or external characteristics, was a significant theological development in the medieval church. While this doctrine became central to Catholic theology, it was a point of disagreement with Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, who rejected transubstantiation and developed their own understandings of the Eucharist. Aquinas' defense of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, based on his metaphysical understanding of substance and accident, faced criticism from those who believed that the doctrine was an unnecessary and overly speculative addition to Christian teaching. The debates surrounding the Eucharist in the wake of the Reformation were deeply influenced by Aquinas' work, and his views continue to be discussed in contemporary theological circles. In addition to these theological controversies, Aquinas' philosophy also encountered challenges from the rise of early modern philosophy. With the advent of thinkers like René Descartes, who sought to ground knowledge in doubt and skepticism, Aquinas' emphasis on the use of reason to understand reality began to face serious challenges. Descartes' focus on the primacy of subjectivity and his emphasis on doubt as a method of arriving at certainty led to a radically different approach to epistemology and metaphysics than that of Aquinas. While Aquinas had integrated a robust Aristotelian view of reality into his Christian framework, early modern philosophers like Descartes and later Kant would argue that human perception and knowledge were not as straightforward as Aquinas had believed. For Descartes, the ability to doubt and question the existence of the external world represented a more secure starting point for knowledge than the Thomistic reliance on sensory experience and empirical observation. This shift away from a metaphysical foundation rooted in objective reality posed significant challenges to Aquinas' view of human knowledge and its relationship to the world. The rise of empiricism and rationalism in the early modern period, with philosophers such as John Locke and David Hume, further complicated Aquinas' intellectual legacy. Empiricists, in particular, emphasized the role of sensory experience in the formation of knowledge, which seemed to conflict with Aquinas' more abstract metaphysical system. Rationalists like Leibniz and Spinoza, on the other hand, developed systems of thought that downplayed the role of sensory perception in favor of innate ideas or deductive reasoning. Both of these schools of thought stood in contrast to Aquinas' moderate realist view, which emphasized the reality of the external world and the ability of human reason to grasp it through empirical observation. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the ongoing debate over the compatibility of faith and reason, central to Aquinas' thought, resurfaced in response to the challenges posed by secularism, naturalism, and existentialism. Modern thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, who emphasized the rejection of divine authority and the primacy of individual experience, presented radical critiques of religious belief. In this context, Aquinas' insistence on the harmony of faith and reason was viewed by some as outdated or irrelevant. Yet his work was also rediscovered in the 20th century as part of the broader Catholic intellectual revival, particularly through the efforts of scholars like Jacques Maritain and Étienne Gilson, who sought to integrate Thomism into modern thought. The controversies surrounding Aquinas' theology and philosophy highlight the enduring complexity and significance of his intellectual contributions. His synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, his views on grace, salvation, and the sacraments, and his commitment to the role of reason in understanding divine truths have generated significant debate throughout the centuries. These controversies, while sometimes challenging Aquinas' legacy, also reflect the richness of his thought and its ability to engage with both theological and philosophical questions in a profound way. The ongoing relevance of Aquinas' work in contemporary debates about faith, reason, and the nature of reality demonstrates his lasting impact on the intellectual tradition. The influence of Thomas Aquinas on Christian thought, particularly within the Roman Catholic Church, remains significant in the modern era. His integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology provided a systematic framework that addressed many of the intellectual and theological concerns of his time. Yet, Aquinas' impact extends far beyond the Middle Ages and the era of scholasticism. His ideas continue to inform modern Christian thought, not only in theological circles, but also in broader discussions on ethics, morality, natural law, and the relationship between science and religion. This chapter will explore Aquinas' ongoing influence in modern Christian theology, particularly in the Catholic tradition, and how Thomism continues to shape contemporary debates on faith, reason, and the nature of human existence. One of the most significant ways in which Aquinas' thought has influenced modern Christian theology is through the official endorsement of his ideas by the Catholic Church. Throughout the centuries, Aquinas has been recognized as a central figure in Catholic thought, with his works becoming foundational in the formation of Catholic doctrine. In the 13th century, Pope Urban IV declared that Aquinas' Summa Theologica would be studied at universities across Europe, and in 1879, Pope Leo XIII issued the encyclical Aeterni Patris, which encouraged a revival of Thomistic philosophy and theology. Pope Leo XIII recognized Aquinas' ability to reconcile faith and reason, seeing in his work a comprehensive theological system that could address the challenges posed by the modern world. The encyclical called for a return to Aquinas' teachings in order to combat the growing influence of secularism, rationalism, and modernism, all of which were seen as undermining traditional Christian doctrines. In addition to the papal endorsement of Thomism, Aquinas' influence is particularly evident in the Catholic Church's moral and ethical teachings. His ideas about natural law, the role of reason in discerning moral truths, and the objective nature of ethics have had a lasting impact on the Church's stance on issues such as human rights, social justice, and the sanctity of life. Aquinas' conception of natural law, which posits that there are moral principles inherent in human nature that can be discerned through reason, has been a cornerstone in Catholic moral theology. In particular, his ideas about the dignity of the human person, the importance of the common good, and the moral responsibility to care for the poor and vulnerable have been foundational in shaping the Catholic Church's social teachings. This can be seen in the Church's advocacy for human rights and its consistent opposition to practices such as abortion, euthanasia, and capital punishment. Aquinas' emphasis on the compatibility of faith and reason has also had a profound effect on how contemporary theologians approach the relationship between science and religion. In the modern era, the rise of scientific discoveries and advancements, particularly in the fields of physics, biology, and cosmology, has posed significant challenges to traditional religious views about the world. For many, the perceived conflict between science and faith has led to skepticism about the role of religious belief in an increasingly secularized society. However, Aquinas' philosophical framework offers a way to reconcile scientific understanding with theological beliefs. His argument that reason and faith can complement each other, rather than being in opposition, has provided a model for Catholic theologians seeking to engage with scientific findings while remaining true to their religious convictions. The ongoing dialogue between faith and reason, a hallmark of Thomistic thought, has been particularly relevant in the Catholic Church's response to the theory of evolution. While some religious groups have rejected evolutionary theory due to its perceived conflict with biblical accounts of creation, Catholic thinkers influenced by Aquinas have found a way to integrate evolutionary science with Christian teachings. Aquinas' view of creation, in which God is understood as the ultimate cause of all that exists, provides room for the acceptance of scientific theories about the origins of life without undermining the belief in God as the creator. The Church's position, as articulated in documents such as Humani Generis, 1950, and Fides Et Ratio, 1998, reflects this Thomistic commitment to reconciling faith with reason, asserting that the study of the natural world can lead to a deeper understanding of God's creation. In addition to his influence on the Catholic Church's teachings on science and ethics, Aquinas' thought has also played a crucial role in contemporary Christian apologetic. Christian apologists, particularly those who seek to defend the rationality of belief in God, have turned to Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God, such as his 5 ways, the cosmological arguments for God's existence, as key elements of their theological arsenal. These arguments, which rely on reason and observation of a natural world to establish the necessity of a first cause or unmoved mover, continue to be central to discussions about the rationality of belief in God. Apologists have used these arguments to engage with modern atheism, secularism, and scientific naturalism, asserting that belief in God is not only rational, but also supported by the evidence of the natural world. Aquinas' influence is not limited to Catholic thought alone. While his philosophy and theology were developed within a distinctly Catholic context, his ideas have had a significant impact on other branches of Christianity as well. Protestant thinkers, particularly those in the Reformed tradition, have engaged with Aquinas' work, especially in relation to his views on the nature of grace, salvation, and the sacraments. While there are areas of disagreement between Thomism and Reformed theology, many Protestant theologians have acknowledged the intellectual rigor of Aquinas' thought and his contributions to the understanding of Scripture and Christian doctrine. His emphasis on the necessity of grace for salvation, his systematic approach to theology, and his ability to synthesize various strands of Christian thought have made him a figure of lasting importance across denominational lines. Moreover, Aquinas' influence extends beyond theology into philosophy, ethics, and political thought. His contributions to ethical theory, particularly his concept of virtue ethics, continue to shape contemporary discussions on morality. Aquinas' view of the moral life as the pursuit of human flourishing, grounded in the natural law and the virtues, has been influential in modern ethical theory. His emphasis on the development of character and the cultivation of virtues, such as prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, has shaped the way many modern ethicists approach questions of personal morality and social justice. In political theory, Aquinas' views on the common good, the role of government, and the relationship between law and morality have influenced modern thinkers on topics ranging from the nature of human rights to the principles of just governance. In the field of political philosophy, Aquinas' ideas about the nature of law have had a profound impact on modern legal thought. His distinction between natural law, which is accessible to human reason, and positive law, which is the law created by human institutions, has been foundational in the development of Western legal systems. Aquinas' understanding of law as a rational order that serves the common good has influenced both Catholic and secular legal thinkers. His thought on the relationship between the divine law, natural law, and human law continues to inform contemporary debates on issues such as the role of religion in public life, the nature of justice, and the relationship between the state and the individual. Despite the widespread influence of Thomism in the modern era, some contemporary scholars have critiqued Aquinas' thought, particularly in light of more recent developments in philosophy, science, and theology. Some argue that Aquinas' reliance on Aristotelian metaphysics may be outdated in the context of modern philosophy, with its emphasis on scientific naturalism, relativism, and postmodern skepticism. Others have pointed to his medieval worldview, which assumed a geocentric universe and a static view of nature, as a limitation in light of contemporary scientific discoveries. However, even critics of Thomism acknowledge its intellectual rigor and the lasting impact it has had on Christian thought and Western philosophy. Aquinas' philosophy, with its commitment to reason, natural law, and the compatibility of faith and reason, continues to provide a framework for engaging with contemporary issues. Whether in the realm of ethics, political philosophy, or the relationship between science and religion, Aquinas' thought remains a touchstone for Christian thinkers seeking to engage the modern world while remaining grounded in the theological and philosophical traditions of the past. His emphasis on the search for truth, the rationality of the Christian faith, and the moral order of the universe ensures that his influence will continue to shape Christian theology and philosophy for generations to come. Thomas Aquinas' influence on modern Christian thought is profound and enduring. His teachings continue to inform Catholic theology and ethics, as well as broader Christian apologetic and the relationship between faith and reason. His contributions to natural law, virtue ethics, and political philosophy have had a lasting impact on Western thought, and his work remains central to contemporary debates on science, morality, and the existence of God. As such, Aquinas' intellectual legacy endures as a vital source of wisdom and insight, offering a path for modern Christians to navigate the complexities of the modern world while remaining true to the truths of their faith. The enduring legacy of Thomas Aquinas in the 21st century is a testament to the profound depth and intellectual rigor of his thought. Despite the centuries that have passed since his death, Aquinas' influence continues to reverberate across a variety of disciplines, from theology and philosophy to ethics and law. His efforts to reconcile faith with reason and his synthesis of Christian doctrine with Aristotelian philosophy have provided a lasting foundation for both Catholic thought and Western intellectual tradition as a whole. In this chapter, we will examine how Aquinas' legacy has been preserved and continues to shape contemporary discourse in theology, philosophy, and beyond. Additionally, we will explore the ways in which Aquinas' ideas are engaged with and critiqued in modern times, and how his contributions remain relevant in addressing the pressing challenges of the 21st century. One of the key aspects of Aquinas' enduring legacy is his profound influence on contemporary Catholic theology. As the intellectual cornerstone of Catholic thought, Aquinas' theology has been continuously revived, particularly since the late 19th century, in response to the rise of secularism and the challenges posed by modernism. As previously mentioned, Pope Leo XI's 1879 encyclical Aeterni Patris called for a return to Thomistic thought, and since then, Aquinas' works have become foundational in the formation of Catholic doctrine. His contributions to natural theology, the doctrine of grace, and the nature of divine revelation continue to shape the official teaching of the Church. The Second Vatican Council, which convened in the 1960s, reinforced the importance of Thomism in Catholic theology by acknowledging Aquinas as a model of how faith and reason can coexist. This reaffirmation of Aquinas' thought has allowed his intellectual framework to remain a touchstone for Catholic theologians and remains a cornerstone for the Catholic Church's engagement with contemporary theological questions. In addition to his role in Catholic theology, Aquinas' influence extends into ecumenical dialogue between Catholicism and other Christian denominations. The systematic nature of his theology, with its emphasis on logical clarity, coherence, and the integration of Scripture and tradition, provides a model for engaging with both internal and external theological disputes. While there are certainly areas of doctrinal disagreement between Catholicism and Protestantism, particularly in regard to the sacraments and the nature of salvation, many Protestant theologians continue to appreciate Aquinas' contributions to Christian thought. His understanding of natural law, ethics, and the philosophy of religion continues to inform Protestant discussions on morality, the existence of God, and the interplay between reason and revelation. Aquinas' ability to build bridges between different theological traditions by emphasizing common truths and addressing shared questions remains a valuable contribution to Christian ecumenism in the modern world. Aquinas' legacy also persists in philosophical discussions about the nature of reality, ethics, and metaphysics. The tradition of Thomistic philosophy, which includes both his metaphysical system and his ethical framework, continues to be a source of intellectual engagement in contemporary philosophy. One of the central aspects of Aquinas' philosophy is his commitment to realism, particularly his belief in the existence of objective reality that is knowable through both sensory experience and reason. In an age increasingly dominated by postmodern relativism, which challenges the possibility of objective truth, Aquinas' metaphysical realism provides a robust counterpoint. His insistence that human beings can come to know the world through both empirical observation and rational deduction offers an alternative to more skeptical or relativistic approaches to knowledge. Philosophers who defend realism and objectivity in metaphysics frequently cite Aquinas as a foundational thinker, whose approach to the relationship between the mind and the external world remains a touchstone in contemporary debates about knowledge, truth, and reality. Aquinas' moral philosophy, particularly his concept of natural law, also continues to shape contemporary ethical discussions. His idea that there are objective moral principles grounded in human nature, principles that can be discovered through reason, has provided a foundation for many modern discussions about human rights and social justice. Natural law theory, as developed by Aquinas, argues that moral knowledge is accessible to all human beings through their rational nature, regardless of religious belief. This has made Thomistic natural law a key point of reference in contemporary debates about ethics and human rights, particularly in the context of discussions on universal moral norms. Issues such as abortion, euthanasia, and same-sex marriage are often discussed through the lens of natural law, with Aquinas' principles providing a basis for arguments about the inherent dignity of the human person and the moral order of society. His emphasis on virtue ethics, the cultivation of character, and the pursuit of human flourishing continues to be influential in modern ethical theory. In the field of political philosophy, Aquinas' views on law and the state continue to be studied and applied to contemporary issues. His understanding of law as an ordinance of reason for the common good has informed modern discussions about the relationship between morality and the legal system. Aquinas' distinction between natural law, human law, and divine law provides a framework for understanding the role of law in society and its connection to broader moral principles. His concept of the common good, which emphasizes the welfare of the entire community over individual interests, continues to shape discussions on social justice and the role of government in promoting human flourishing. In the context of debates about democracy, human rights, and the role of the state, Aquinas' political philosophy offers insights into the moral responsibilities of citizens and governments alike. His views on justice, the role of the ruler, and the rights of the people continue to influence political thinkers and lawmakers today. Aquinas' influence also extends to the field of education, particularly in the context of Catholic institutions. His systematic approach to theology and philosophy has become a model for Catholic education at all levels, with his works forming the core of curricula in Catholic universities and seminaries around the world. The study of Aquinas' thought is central to the intellectual formation of Catholic scholars and clergy, as well as lay people interested in deepening their understanding of Catholic doctrine. His emphasis on reason, intellectual humility, and the pursuit of truth continues to inform Catholic educational institutions, which seek to provide a holistic education that integrates faith with reason. Aquinas' belief that true knowledge leads to a deeper understanding of God and the world continues to be a guiding principle in Catholic educational philosophy, emphasizing the unity of truth across various academic disciplines. In the realm of interfaith dialogue, Aquinas' thought continues to play a significant role. His respectful engagement with non-Christian philosophers, particularly his appropriation of Aristotelian ideas, serves as a model for dialogue between different religious and intellectual traditions. Aquinas' recognition of the validity of reason in understanding universal truths, as well as his openness to the insights of philosophers outside the Christian tradition, has led to fruitful conversations between Christian thinkers and scholars of other faiths. The Thomistic tradition's emphasis on the compatibility of reason and faith provides a basis for engaging with a variety of worldviews, allowing for constructive dialogue that acknowledges both the similarities and differences between religious perspectives. In the context of global interfaith relations, Aquinas' ideas about the nature of truth, the relationship between God and the world, and the importance of charity and justice provide a foundation for building understanding and cooperation across religious divides. Despite the ongoing influence of Thomism, Aquinas' legacy has not been without its critics. Some contemporary scholars argue that his reliance on Aristotelian metaphysics, particularly his views on substance, causality, and the nature of God, is outdated in light of modern scientific and philosophical developments. Others have questioned the compatibility of his theology with contemporary understandings of the world, particularly in light of developments in physics, biology, and cosmology. However, even those who critique Aquinas' thought often acknowledge its profound intellectual rigor and lasting impact on the development of Christian theology and Western philosophy. The The continued engagement with his ideas, both for and against, is a testament to the enduring relevance of his thought in addressing some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. In conclusion, Thomas Aquinas' legacy in the 21st century remains vital and far-reaching. His contributions to Christian theology, philosophy, ethics, and politics continue to influence contemporary discussions in a wide range of fields. Aquinas' synthesis of faith and reason, his commitment to the objective nature of truth, and his emphasis on the moral order of the universe provide a rich intellectual framework for addressing the challenges of the modern world. As the world continues to confront complex questions about the relationship between science and religion, ethics, social justice, and the nature of human existence, Aquinas' thought remains a powerful guide for those seeking to integrate reason and faith in their pursuit of truth. His legacy is one that continues to inspire scholars, theologians, and philosophers, ensuring that his influence will endure for generations to come.